So good. All right. Welcome to JavaScript Module Pattern. So the module pattern, in this case, is we're using it with JavaScript, and basically it helps you keep your code modular, gives you privacy, state, using closures, helps you with namespacing, maintainability, and code reuse, which I will be focusing on quite a bit. So I work for Miles, and you can find me there. Okay, so you probably end up with theme JavaScript files that just seem to go on and on and on, and it's tough to maintain, tough to debug, and you can't reuse it. And you may end up with really lengthy JavaScript files in your modules too, but pretty much all of this will apply to modules, but I'm focusing on the theme JS for the moment. So this is what we're going to cover, basically the module pattern in general. Go through some code, using it with jsHint, organizing your JavaScript, and then implementing it with Drupal 7 and 8, and then some tooling using grunt-concat and bower. So how is modern front-end development like a platypus? It's a mess of cool parts that make together something amazing, right? So don't be a doof, be a JavaScript super agent, right? Who doesn't love Perry? Okay, I'm not going to go through all these things. I'm just going to cover them. They'll be in the slides. But basically, it really helps improve your JavaScript. There's some disadvantages to using it. They're a little arcane. We won't cover those either right now, but they're here for your reference later. Okay, I have a lot of slides, so we're going to get to the meat of it. So does everybody clear on like IIFEs and scope and closures, or? All right, maybe we'll come back to that if we have questions. I gave a version of this presentation a couple months ago, and apparently I didn't cover some basic concepts, so we can come back to it if there's questions. Okay, code. So the way you structure the module pattern is basically you wrap everything in an IIFE, which is I'm like skipping over stuff in my head and I'm messing myself up. So this is the structure. You wrap your function in the parens, and then you pass in your parameters here, and then they get received into your function here. So jQuery becomes $. This is basically the same thing as if you were putting this after a function name, like my function, then you have parens and you pass stuff into it. It's just a different way of writing it all in one line. So that's the basic structure. Now, if you want to export something from your module, I should say, with module patterns, you're returning an object. Okay, you're always returning an object. It contains methods, properties, and so here we have this. We're returning this something called do something. It's equal to this function, and you can see my is an object. I'm assigning a property, a method, and I'm returning my. So now do something equals the object on the outside. Do something equals this object that on the inside of the function is my. Everybody with me so far? Okay. You get to have private and public methods and properties with the module pattern. I've conveniently named them private and public, so it's really easy to figure out which is which. And then when you use it outside, you just call do something dot public property, or you reference do something dot public property, or you call do something dot public method. But outside of this, private is private. You cannot get to private variable from outside this code. So now internal member referencing, to reference another public property or method within your code, you have to use this. Everybody's familiar with this? Okay. It's because once you've created do something, later in the code, Java has to know which scope, JavaScript needs to know which scope, and by using this, it knows. So here, we can use the private variables. You don't need this. Public, you need this. So far, so good? Okay. Next, there's various types of module patterns. We've got augmentation. Basically, you want to extend a previously declared module. So you've defined someplace else the do something module. You want to add something else to it. That's called augmentation. You pass it in the bottom. You set this to the same name. On the inside, you can call it whatever you want. We add the new public property, and now our do something has whatever it used to have plus this new property. So this way, you can different parts of your code continue to build on other pieces of code. Loose augmentation basically uses this cool little syntax down here that basically you're passing in do something just like the last slide, or if it doesn't exist, you're giving it an empty object. So this way, it doesn't matter which order your modules load, because if there's do something, it's going to augment it. If there's no do something, it's going to create it as an empty object. And I have lots of little notes down here that will help explain things further if you have any questions. Tight augmentation basically enforces order. So if you have some later module code that requires on previous module code, this will enforce that because there is no or empty object. Oh, and here's also an example, like if you want to take the old method, you set it to a new method. See, sorry, old method's here, your new method will be defined here, and you're going to do maybe something before you do your old method. So this way you can actually take methods that were in your code and wrap them and create like a facade pattern, some call it. The revealing module pattern dispenses with the object literal notation for public members at the, and this is one of the gotchas, at the expense of not allowing overrides in other code. So what this does is it returns, instead of setting my equals an object and then setting my dot something, now you're returning the object literal directly. Some people like to see it this way because now you have your public property is here and your inside one is here. Oh, here it is. Nicely named public property now points to your internal badly named public property, which is here. So this is another occasion of like the facade pattern where you can basically take internal functions but would be private, and by making them public by passing them in the object. There's other advanced ways of doing module patterns. I'm not going to get into those two because the previous ones cover most use cases. Drupal 7 uses IIFEs, as does Drupal 8. And you'll see Drupal 7 even uses the syntax that looks a lot like the loose augmentation assignment concept. some examples. So I always try to keep your main, this could be your theme JavaScript, or it could be your module JavaScript. Try to keep it very short and to the point. You wrap it in an IIFE. Here you can see I'm passing in various things like underscore, jQuery, Drupal, window, everything. And underscore gets mapped as underscore, so internally you know what it is, but you don't have to worry about the alias on the outside because sometimes those get overwritten. Same thing with jQuery goes to $, and then whatever modules, like Drupal is an object literal, or is an object really in this case, where you can use like normal. So here's just a basic module that imports. So you can see I'm passing in window and document, and I'm calling them window and document. I'm just doing some basic JavaScript stuff, but it's modular, it's reusable, it doesn't have other dependencies. Loose augmentation, here I'm passing in underscore and I'm augmenting it. So, and I'm just borrowing this from underscore. So here I'm passing in underscore or an empty object at the bottom. At the top, I have var underscore, because that's how most people are going to refer to it. And here's my function. Internally, I'm calling it underscore, and I'm adding these two methods. So after this, any other module that requires underscore will have access to the debounce, which is a great method, by the way. So you can use jQuery module just like you would normally. As long as you pass it in, it's there, and you call it as normal. You can extend jQuery inside the module pattern. You pass in jQuery, set your dollar functions, $.fn rather, and you return. And suddenly you've extended jQuery. Drupal behaviors. Again, you pass in Drupal. I'm not sure why I have my object here. Anyway, oh, I'm returning it, right. And then you just set your Drupal behaviors like this. It should seem familiar. The nice thing about this is the module pattern keeps this all clean, all separate. If you want to define multiple Drupal behaviors, you can just pass in Drupal.behaviors, and now you send it in as behaviors, and now you don't have to put the Drupal part, the Drupal dot, because you've passed in the object that's down one level. And then if you wanted to just define a single Drupal behavior, you could just define it here with my Drupal module. Okay. JSHint. We're going to get to some tooling now. JSHint isn't required from the module pattern, what I think is a great idea. ND8 uses it, so probably a good idea to start knowing it anyway. So basically, and then grunt. Grunt helps you take all these, I should say, I skipped over that slide, I think. You have all these modules, you put them all in separate files, right? So you don't have that one JavaScript file that's like 500 lines. You keep them all separate, you name them all nicely, and this way you can reuse them and you know exactly where the code is, and you're less likely to have like git conflicts and whatever, because no one's likely to be touching the same little file that you are. But now you've got could be dozens of all these little JavaScript files. So how do you put them together? Well, I'm going to get too much into this. There's some detail here on how to get grunt running. This is how you install jsHint through grunt. Then you have to load your task for jsHint in your grunt file. You define some stuff in your jsHint file, and what jsHint's going to do is it's not going to allow you to use globals that aren't defined. So when you pass in jQuery into your module, you have to tell it that it's a global. Otherwise, jsHint will be like, what is this? And the true and the false tell it if you're allowed to modify it. So if you want to have a global, it's a library or something you're using. Like in this case, we're disallowing jsHint from, we're telling jsHint that you're disallowing the Drupal object from being modified. Right? So anywhere in your code you try to set Drupal to something or modify it, jsHint is going to kick it out. Then you have to add some jsHint stuff to your grunt file. Not going to go through every line. You have to define the grunt task. And then you can just run, in this case, grunt.js to run the jsHint task. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at all the JS you've defined in grunt, and it's going to parse it and make sure you're not doing anything weird and you have certain standards are met. So how do you use all these files in Drupal? Well, in Drupal 7, you've got the Drupal add.js. Probably you're all familiar with that. Or you can use the attach, where basically you attach a particular JavaScript file to an element. Or you can use Drupal 7 libraries, which are nice because they're basically how Drupal 8 JavaScript libraries are working. So you have to define, in Drupal 7, it's in code, you define the library, which is pretty much the same information that would have been in using the attach method. And then you attach it to an element, but instead of having to define a whole array of data, you just point it to the library. Drupal 8 libraries. Pretty much the difference is here is you define the library in YAML. What is different is now you can attach it and use it in lots of different ways. You can attach it in Twig. You can attach in the YAML file, a themes YAML file, so it goes everywhere in your site. You can attach it via preprocessed hook. And you can also use the render array. And there's hook page attachment. So there's like 5 ways of attaching your JavaScript in Drupal 8 once you've defined your library. It all depends on your use case. If you need it on the whole page, if you need it with a particular element, if you need it conditionally, if you want it for your entire site, like say it's controlling your menu. But we still have like dozens of individual JavaScript files. So there's a grunt module, a plugin called concat, which basically allows you to concatenate lots of other files, which is great. So now you don't have all these individual files, you've got one big file, say if it's your theme file. But the downside is you get all the JavaScript files in one big file. So if you have a certain section of your site that doesn't use all of your JavaScript, and you only want it to load certain JavaScript, this is one of the disadvantages, but we'll get to solving that later. So here's some steps on installing concat. Again, npm install to get the grunt plugin. You have to load the task in your grunt file. Then you have to define how concat is going to work. So here, this is like basically the method that concat offers. We've got some options, which this is tacks on a semicolon after your code, which is called the defensive semicolon. So in case you accidentally forgot your semicolon, it adds one. Of course, if you're using jsHint, it's not going to let you forget the semicolon. You can define your source maps for debugging, because now, kind of like if you're using Sass or something, all of your individual JavaScript files are piled into one, and it may not be clear what file had the original. And this orange, you have null, missing files. And then here you define
I think this is short for distribution. You define your source files. So you can hear I've included my 5 module pattern, individual JavaScript patterns. They're going to make one compiled script, and when you run grunt, you're going to get it out. The disadvantage here is if any of these have dependencies on something else, you have to figure it out all yourself and make sure you keep them in the right order, because there's no lifting, right? If everyone's familiar. Okay. Then you define your grunt task. Oh, I didn't show how to run. Oh yeah, you just run grunt.js, would run it, it would concatenate all your modules into one file, and you'd be off and running. And then you could use any of your methods you wanted to define that file in your Drupal to get it actually loaded when Drupal runs. There's lots of other modules and ways of loading using concat to like load certain files, exclude certain files, but I'm not going to get into that. Now, if you're going to reuse these modules and you have to worry about dependency order, there's a solution to that. It's called a package manager, and the one I'm using here is Bower. So, how many people are familiar with Bower? Oh, good. Okay, good. So, basically, it's the same concept as the libraries. You have to give some metadata to each one of your modules. You have to install it first. Now, you want to create a package. Now, what this means now is you don't put all of your JavaScript files in one directory. You put them each in its own separate subdirectory. You run Bower init, and it will interactively, you can also create this file manually, but it's easy. Bower init is going to ask you things like, what's the version? What's the main file? You know, it's like my module.js, whatever it is. The type of package, globals, this is important. This defines it as a module pattern. And then mark this package as private. Most of the time it's going to be yes. If you mark it as not private, you could accidentally use Bower to upload your JavaScript module to the Bower online repo where everybody else would have access to it. So most likely it's going to be private, unless of course you're contributing back to the rest of the world, then all good. Oh, semver. We're all familiar with semantic versioning. One dot done something, dot something, optionally dash something else. That's important, because you can edit this file and put what requirements it has. So if your jQuery module requires jQuery, you can list it as a requirement, and you can also list its version. So here's just some. So you're going to want to give your JavaScript module that's you've now run Bower int on. You're going to probably want to put it in your repo, and you can put it in there as its own repository. So now you've got a repo of just this one module with the Bower meta information, and now Bower can reference that particular repo of just that module. So you can reuse it. So here's just some Git stuff about making sure. Git tag, people are familiar with Git tag? Maybe not. Anyway, that's how you give a version number to your code. Then you want to go into your Bower RC file, and you tell it how to find your new module repositories. Now, Bower will automatically pull from the Bower, I think, .com site. There they have a repository up there. It will also pull from GitHub automatically. So you can require GitHub modules directly by just putting the package name and the user right into your requirement file. And it will automatically pull down that repo, install it to the right place, and when it has to build, it will pull in those requirements or those dependencies automatically. If you have a private repository like GitLab, you can modify your Bower RC to define your own custom repository. Shorthand resolver is, like I said, if everybody's familiar with GitHub, you usually have like a username / repository. That's the shorthand name. So basically this says, find it, gitlab.mycompany.com. Whoop, got cut off a little bit. Shorthand.git. So in my case, it'd be Todd/mymodule.git. It pulls down Git automatically for you, the Git repo. Now, you want to tell your particular module that it requires some other dependency. So it's Bower install user / the repo name. Like it could be jQuery / jQuery. The version, if you have a specific version. And it will automatically update the Bower file. So when you try to use that module, it will automatically pull in that dependency. And Bower is kind of like Composer or NPM. It's got a full suite of commands. There's Bower info package, list package, all like the sort of things you'd be accustomed to with a package manager. Now, so now that you've Bower-fied all your modules, great. How do you get them all using your tooling to come together into one file? Use grunt-bower-concat. So you have to install it, npm install. You have to define your the grunt task. Now you add some bower-concat in your grunt file, and here we're going to define a destination option. Here we have another defensive semicolon. Here we're defining our destination, and what it's going to do in this case, it's basically going to take all of the JavaScript you've defined in like your theme, and it's going to pull them all of the dependencies, download any of the repos that are dependencies. It's going to put them all in dependency order in one file. So good, we've solved the dependency issue. We don't have to worry about listing out all of our modules in the right order. It does it magically for you. Pretty good. You still have the problem that it all goes into one big file, which you may or may not want. So there's this new parameter, include with dependencies, that allows you to split up how the Bower-concat creates the files. So in this case, we're defining this particular task. We give it another defensive semicolon, include with dependencies true, and now you specifically include JSB and JSC, and it's going to create one destination file, B and C. Now if C requires D and D requires E, it's going to pull those down, put them in dependency order, and they'll show up in your B and C. Everybody following me so far? All right. So now you can just repeat this pattern as many times as you want. So if you want to have a couple different, you've got different JavaScript for different sections, or you want to have different files to load independently, you can just create different tasks. In this case, I'm pulling in JavaScript B and C. Here I'm pulling in JavaScript D. I know D requires C, so I'm going to get D with C. The disadvantage of using this, though, is if B and C required jQuery and D required jQuery, and you tried to load them on the same page, you're going to load jQuery twice. So you have to be, there's a trade-off here. It's a little gotcha. So you have to be a little aware of that.
No include once.
Right, you could do that, yeah. And I think I blew through this really quick. I did. So there's further reading. Questions? There's me again. Questions?
Slides available?
Yeah, I'll post them on my GitHub. Yes.
So if you want access to one Drupal behavior from another, do you just pass it in the same way that jQuery can be passed in?
Well, you could. You'd probably just pass in Drupal and have access to everything.
Okay.
Questions? Yes.
Why would you go and why would you concat here when Drupal will concat with the dependencies if you attach it properly?
Well, you can do that, right? So you can go in and define all of your libraries in Drupal. See, with Drupal 8, or if you're using the libraries in either Drupal 7 or Drupal 8, you can define all your dependencies. But if you want to use like a reusable module you want to share, okay, then how does the next person know that the dependency of your module is some other module, right? Because that information is like locked into Drupal. So if you define the Bower information for it, you can reuse it across without having to define the dependencies. So it's really, you're moving the dependency management outside of the Drupal libraries with the JavaScript. So the metadata kind of goes with the code instead of it being divorced from the code. Any other?
So, just to add on to that, I mean, I use it in order to just be able to organize my JavaScript a little bit better than 100 small files that each is one thing. And then I can count all that. So I use both.
Yeah, I think it's
Just for organization.
especially if you're going to be making lots of sites. Hopefully, we're all making lots of sites. You're going to end up with these same chunks of code over and over. You're always going to be using debounds. You're going to use, all these little things like a vertical alignment or equal heights type of module. All these modules you're going to reuse and reuse and reuse. Why just keep copying it from the last repo into the new repo, where you can put them in their own repos and just reference them in your Bower file for your main theme JavaScript, and it goes and gets them for you. Yes?
I'll take it another step and say, if you have a set of globals and variables that aren't used, but are getting concatenated in before minification, they'll get pulled out. So then you're not loading unneeded code, where Drupal doesn't, well, D7 doesn't really utilize that logic within the concatenation process.
Right. Yeah, things change a little bit with D8 because the way you have to define all your libraries in YAML. But again, you're still faced with the idea that now Drupal knows the dependencies and the versions and whatever of my reusable JavaScript modules. But if I want to put that someplace, unless you put it all in a comment block or something, no one really knows. And then if you've changed the module, say you have something but a module that's more complex, a JavaScript module, and it's gone from version 1 to version 2, and now there's breaking changes. Well, and you have other modules that are dependent on it, how are they going to know, unless you're commenting all that in the top of your doc block. If you do it this way, you tag that module with the version number, you put it in its own repo. Later on, my new module is using the new version of that dependency, version 2. It's going to go and make sure it gets version 2, just like every package manager does. Your old code, if it gets rebuilt, will still call the old version.
In Drupal 7, you would also add the JS to theme, themes.info file
Yeah.
versus the add JS. Which one is there any like trade-off?
Yeah, you know, I didn't actually mention putting in the theme file. Yeah, you can put it there. It's just, it's like kind of, you know, if you're putting in a theme file, the downside is it's everywhere, right? You have no control over it. It's going to load it every time. But you're right, that is another way of loading in Drupal 7 I neglected to add. Yes?
So when you do the concat, you did mention that, let's say if you're doing two separate kind of packages, and they both require the same item, let's say jQuery. So is there a way where you compile it with dependencies? Is there a way to say, hey, both of these requires, you know, jQuery is just not, I'm going to include it separately, and just when you concatenate it, don't include jQuery as a dependency. Is there a way to do that?
That's a good question. And right now, the Bower grunt-concat does not have an ability to like exclude.
Yeah.
Actually, the include with dependencies functionality I added to Bower-concat because I wanted the ability for it to have multiple files. Because by default with Bower-concat, if you just do an include, it won't include dependencies, which is of limited use. Because at that point, you're not really getting anything. You just have concat. So I talked to the owner. I did a poll, added that. But we've talked about adding the functionality you asked for. As soon as I get around to it. Yes?
Wasn't that the power of having like a YAML file to control that, like E8 does with the libraries.yaml file? That you're listing out your dependencies right there in a central location. So it's acting as maybe more like a central hub for controlling that stuff. So you can actually see listed out in an easy to read format where those dependencies are already coming in. Right. And it's just the YAML. So I mean it's plain old text that.
Yeah, I have it. I think I have it here. You know, I didn't include an actual output of what the Bower file looks like, but it's basically JSON, and it just has the name of the package, the version. It's all human readable, and it has dependencies. In fact, it looks almost exactly like Drupal's YAML file, except it's not in the YAML format.
Right.
And really, it comes down to is, like I said, with Drupal 8, things obviously change because you're doing libraries. But you could, with Drupal 8, just include your one theme JS as a library without breaking it up. I mean, a lot of people will probably just continue to put like hundreds of lines of code into their theme JavaScript, including it once as a single library and being done with it. But if you're going to break it up into separate files, then you have to create a library for each one, and you have to define each one in your YAML file. But if you're going to concentrate on reusing these modules, I mean, if it's just internal to this and it's very unique to that particular site, sure, just define it in a YAML, in the YAML file, and let Drupal deal with it. But if you want to make modules that are reusable, that you can use from site to site, or say you want to make them publicly available, then you want to put the meta information with the code. And that way you can semver all of the versions so people are always getting the right version of your code. Kind of think of it like jQuery modules, right? People are always upgrading their jQuery modules and there's breaking changes because there's not really a good semver with those things generally. People just download it and hope it works. But if you're doing real package management, you're getting the exact version or close to the version you need. Yeah, there are two ways of doing it. It really kind of depends on your preference. Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I have to say I'm totally new to this. I didn't even know about this concept until I looked at the session description. last night and said, I don't know anything about this, I want to find out a little bit about it. I am dealing with one site. Do I have any, are there advantages to use this if I really am only going to ever use this on one site?
Well, I covered kind of like the whole vertical here, right? From like what the module pattern is, why you might want to use it, all the way down to, package management and everything in between. So if you just want to use if you're just going to use the JavaScript for one site, I still suggest you consider the module pattern, even if you put them all into one file, right? Because it's going to make you write better JavaScript. It's going to keep you from, you're not going to pollute the global address space, and everything is going to be much cleaner. And if you use jsHint or to check your JavaScript, it's going to really force you to make sure you import all your globals, and it's just going to up your JavaScript game. And it's going to give you stuff like, privacy, whatnot.
Thanks, that was really helpful.
You're welcome. Yes.
Just back to the Drupal 8 YAML file libraries idea. If you can put actual URLs, oh no, I guess that doesn't really help you. Just wasn't sure if that.
Yeah, you can.
Does what Bower does.
You can define an external library. Off the top of my head, you can't semver it, I don't think.
Okay.
It's expecting to pull not a Git repo, it's expecting to pull a specific JavaScript file. Like a lot of people pull, a lot of people will pull like jQuery from a CDN or something. You can do that. I don't have the syntax here.
Oh right, yeah, this is where it is. Yeah.
Right. Something changes with this line off the top of my head. I do not know what it is.
Oh, I think you can just do the 2 slashes and just write it out.
I think there's something more to it, but it's not incredibly complex, as I recall. Any other questions? Yes.
I've seen the argument of gulp versus grunt a few times. I was wondering what your reasons for going with grunt were.
I just started with it.
Okay.
I think the next time I'll do this presentation, I'll probably throw in some information about gulp, but there's already kind of covers a lot of territory. And then Ryan prefers NPM versus Bower. It's just one way of doing it or another. I haven't looked into it. I don't know if there's a Bower-concat type of gulp plugin. There may be.
I believe there's equivalent, yeah.
Yeah, there probably is. And then, you could probably use Bower and NPM or gulp and Bower. It's like, I know this tool chain works.
We have separate requirements for different content types. Like some content types have their own JS for a specialized application, and then we have other JS that goes across the entire site. So we don't want to really dump everything into one JavaScript. So would you do that with like 2 grunt files? How would you?
Well, if you're using 7, right, you could just, where's my example? You could create one JavaScript module that basically has a requirement of like the 3 modules you need in one section, and the other module would have a requirement that has like 2 or 3 other JavaScript modules for a different section, and then you might have a third that goes across the site, and then you can use libraries or attach or whatever way you wanted to load those things when and where you needed them. And of course, if you do that, you just have to make sure they don't have a shared dependency, because you'll end up loading that code twice. Other questions?
Everybody, sure.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe this is too basic, but if the client is downloading the JavaScript anyway, like, and caching it, then isn't there an advantage to just sending them one single JavaScript file that they're not going to have to keep requesting anyway, as opposed to breaking it all up and having more round trips to the server?
Yes, you'd be correct, except the concat puts it all into one file, and then whatever JavaScript that Drupal gets, if you have that setting set, it's going to aggregate all the JavaScript anyway. So this is really about making it easier for developers to organize their code and make it reusable, right? And if you want, if you broke it into all these separate files, you could go and do a, Drupal add.js for every single one of your module files. But if you've got 24 of them, you have to make sure you add them versus just using something that's going to pull everything in magically. Same thing with your, if you had, well, hopefully everybody's using some kind of SaaS-like thing, but if you wrote, 4 individual CSS files, you could attach them all, and then Drupal's going to aggregate them. Yes?
So you just said pull in everything, and I think you maybe simplified that a little too much.
Okay.
What you actually want to do is just pull in everything that you're actually using on this project, right?
Right.
So you may have, like you say, 24 JavaScript files, but in any particular project, you're only using, say, 6 of them. So you just want to pull in those 6 for this one project, and then.
Right. When I said Drupal will pull it all in, I meant Drupal's going to pull in all of the JS it knows about, right, when it runs.
Right.
But sure, if hopefully, if you're a single coder, you work for a team, over time you might have 100 reusable JavaScript modules. You certainly wouldn't want to pull them all in, but if you pull in one and it's got 3 requirements, then you have to remember, or you have to read your comments. But if you had a Bower file with each one in your repo, it's going to know I need B and C and D needs E, and it's going to pull them all into your project. And then as long as you tell Drupal about them, it's going to load them all up and aggregate them and send them out to the client as one file.
So do you usually have all of that reusable stuff in GitHub so that you don't need to move it in when you're starting a project, or do you how do you guys deal with that stuff?
Well, we have GitLab, and you can, if you don't, if you want to use GitHub and you want them to be private or public, whatever, it's up to you. If you have something like a private repository using GitLab, or it should work with any one of those. I mean, the example I have is for GitLab. I know it works. I'm sure it probably works with Bitbucket and those other ones.
But you just have a collection of all those little tools you have, and then you just
Right.
quickly create those dependencies.
Right. Then you just do the Bower include. It changes the Bower file to write that there, and as soon as you run Bower, it's going to pull them in. If anybody's familiar with Composer or NPM, it's the same concept. Yeah. Cool. Everybody still clear on, since we have time, on closures and IIFEs and all that good stuff? Closures. Sure. Closures have to do with scope. And let's see if I can explain it without going too much. So basically, first of all, you create a new scope anytime there's a function keyword, right? That's the only time, well, up until JS 2015, where we introduced let and const, but we're not going to worry about those right now. So basically, the only time you create a new scope in JavaScript is when you hit function keyword. And what a closure does is it basically tells JavaScript to remember the scope, the parent scope it's in. So it's not only remembering its own scope, but its parent scope, which is pretty interesting. So no matter where you run it later, it still remembers where it was instantiated. So here's an example here. A closure means the inner child function memorizes the outer parent local scope so that it persists between calls to the inner function. So here you can see my function equals function x, my object equals this, my object dot my closure equals function console log x plus plus. X was defined here in the parent. I'm referencing it here in the child. I return my object. Basically, I set this to my function of 10. I call that method. The first time it sends out 10. Second time it sends out 11. Does that seem clear? If I said later, my instance 2 equals my function of 100, my instance 2 of my closure would output 100. Next time I call it to go 101. And they're two separate instances, but two separate parents. That's closure.
It's like static keyword in C where it remembers the.
Yeah, it's part of the stack. Gets stashed. Yeah. Because you don't have to do anything special with your variables. It's really about nesting the functions. And of course, there's lots of like weird exceptions, especially with JS 2015. Cool. Anything else? Thanks for coming.